It's great to follow Dion's talk this morning, and certainly what Mike and Mike were able to share, because it builds, for me, I guess a bit of pressure, but on the other hand, a bit of expectation too. So what is happening in Kenya? What does Kenya have that actually makes it different, that actually distinguishes us? And much like Dion mentioned in the morning, if you're thinking social, if you're thinking as far back as when we were some kind of primordial soup, you cannot escape the African continent or the business that's transacted there, only because, in many regards, you could say, the beginnings of mankind were found here too. So as far back as that, we've had these three things intertwined. Perhaps now we have new meaning that we add to this as a phrase, and certainly that's what's brought each and every one of you here. But to look at the rest of the continent, I hope I'm going to do a decent job, but definitely the speakers before me, you'll see some very, very direct correlations between what I'll share and what they have as well. So this here is a dark picture. It is NASA's picture of the night sky, if you can kind of make out what's there. And this is the old Africa that a lot of people have thought of, so to speak, right? And even as mentioned here, South Africa, there's a lot happening. It's a big bone to chew on if you're thinking about it as a market and the potential that it has. And so it does absorb a lot of companies and people's attention, and has been the gateway into the African continent for quite a while. And certainly on this map, and this map's pretty old at this point, but South Africa actually is possibly the only place, besides North Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa where something's happening. And so in the not too distant past as well, just out of interest, one of the highest profile exports to the rest of Africa was actually special forces from South Africa. So that was about as much as it got. It was, gung-ho private security contractors in any number of these different African countries, because that's pretty much all there is, north of the Limpopo. But besides oil and gas, extractive industries, these kinds of traditional sectors, we're finding South African companies making inroads, financial services, telecoms, as was mentioned earlier, retailers. And the interesting thing is that as Kenya and specifically Nigeria strengthened, in sub-Saharan Africa at least, South Africa's certainly in some regard lost its status as the place to go. It has to compete a lot more. And certainly even for South African companies, there is pressure to know what's happening in the rest of the continent if you are surely to represent it. And there's a lovely little example that that I found here on one of the ways that you'll find some South African companies or people approach the continent, in terms of just the kind of wonder that they have. Can you feel it? Africa, right? And so essentially that's been that wonder of what lies, anything north of Johannesburg, or wherever the borders are and so on. And it's been hard to find companies who've gone in ready to listen, especially in this day and age. South African companies actually have, some of you might know, a reputation. The time you get in the room, those who don't know soon discover. Those who already know, kind of stick their chests out and kind of get ready for battle, because there is a bit of push and pull that's been known to happen when a South African company is getting into the market. Now that said, Jamie Foxx isn't entirely wrong. There is an element of both technology, as it were, specifically this idea of leapfrogging. So not waiting for the technology to, get built, get put in the ground if it's the internet and so on. But this idea that we can move steps ahead, we can skip entire phases of evolution, if you like, and do that through technology. So you have, these cliche images of the Maasai with the phone, and it's whipping out like an iPhone 5, and maybe even surfing on LTE in a place you would never imagine that those two things would even go together, let alone what he uses for a pocket to store the phone itself. Now, I think if you're looking at the continent, to just build a bit of context before diving in, the tide started to turn, arguably about it's 10 years ago now, when this map by Steve Song, representing where we're going to be in 2014 next year, fully comes into play. And you watch a timeline or a time lapse of sorts of the internet and high-speed internet touch the shores of major African cities all across the continent. All right, so fiber, as it were. And in Kenya, we're at no loss with any one of three fiber cables: Seacom, Easy, and Teams. Now, that said, mobile connectivity specifically has been the thing that has driven Kenya to assume the place that it has now, some of the results of which you heard from Mike earlier on. And if you look bottom up at one of the things that's taken place with this has been the emergence of hubs, right? And so these are hubs all across the continent that, thanks to that kind of technology, have responded to the gaps in the market, sometimes glaring gaps that brands, businesses, and enterprises all over have missed completely. And it gives room for people to experiment, and a lot of times the canvas that they use to test things out has been the mobile phone. But beyond that, to get social, to get down to the nuts and bolts of it, we have this lovely infographic by Ivan College, who looked at Facebook users all across the continent. And as you heard, certainly there's a couple key points, if you like. There's 4 regions where Africa seems to excel, if you're thinking about Facebook and its penetration in Africa. It's Egypt. In North Africa, essentially, the Arab Spring. That story kind of wrote itself. In East Africa, it's Kenya. And then you have any one of 4 to 5 other East African countries following suit. In South Africa, it goes without saying. And in West Africa, certainly Nigeria, on the basis of the numbers that they have, the sheer scale and potential scale, it stands out. Now, I was pleasantly surprised to see some Kenyan brands there in the list, and there's a couple others who I'll make mention of. And some of the small little nuances that they've experimented with and seen success in much the same way Diane made the distinction with their customers, in some cases with partners and within the business, and also with, in terms of to break it down, to see trends in work and also in society. And typically you'll find that it's in places you wouldn't expect. And by not expect, much like was alluded this morning, telecoms isn't exactly the place for innovation. Besides being dumb pipes, it tends to be, if you look across Africa, these tend to be government-owned, or the government has a pretty big stake in the enterprise. They tend to be very, monopolistic by their approach, incredibly bureaucratic, and very, very slow to move. But in East Africa, in Kenya specifically, you have one series of things that took place that led to a tipping point that's been responsible for this, M-Pesa, which not only transformed this idea about even what we think as social, right, but even the idea of social business itself has been transformed in many ways. So in 5 years, there's 19 million Kenyans now, over 70% of the adult population who've signed up for this. And this mobile money service essentially allows anybody with a SIM card to turn that SIM card into an ATM card now. And any one of the previous airtime resellers in the country to scale up and essentially function as banks, right? So disrupting the model of a telecommunications company and what they did, and certainly banking and finance and financial inclusion as we know it. Now, in 115 years in Kenya, banks provided customers with 43 licensed commercial banks, 1,045 bank branches, and 1,500 ATMs across the country. While in less than 4 years for M-Pesa, almost 40,000 agents now have completely eclipsed this idea of why do we need a branch? Why do we need to build something? Why can't a person in a t-shirt with a phone with the social capital around a given group of people, why can't they proceed to execute on all of these functions? And so as they've continued to disrupt telecommunications and banking and finance, and by extension insurance and a lot of the service industry, retail and so on, the economy, the Kenyan economy now, over 25% of it essentially is transacted through person-to-person payments. And so you're looking at a society which can't ever go back on this. And some of the things that people use M-Pesa to pay for, they remit hundreds of millions of dollars a month directly to people's phones, so not through Western Union, which M-Pesa would do more in the space of a day or a week than Western Union was doing in a year. In fact, they said at one point that of every, 1 out of every 2 people transacting with mobile money in the world was Kenyan. Right? And this was just by the sheer scale they were able to unlock, and certainly what it did for businesses and for anybody who was contemplating engaging people in a social way, it transformed that as well. And like I said, it's noteworthy because you have a huge multinational, large mobile operator. This actually wasn't meant to happen, not for them at least, by most standards. And so when you have that and the phone assuming this new status, any kind of phone, from a fancy iPhone down to a very, very basic device, assuming the place of a bank card, right, and transforming what people think of a bank, where does that leave the businesses that it's their job to use these same phones and to use traditional media, traditional ways of communicating with people to relate with them? And one interesting stat that I think tells a lot about what's informed them up to now is this. So 99% of all internet connections in Kenya at least happen on a mobile phone. 99%. All right? So we're talking about anybody with so much as fiber and so on, all the cyber cafes combined and the access that people find there, that is 1%. All right? And Kenya's got, at the moment, about, it's a contested figure, but the government pegs it now at 14 million people with access to the internet. So still shy of having penetrated and transformed our society. But of those people, as you saw, in that list that Mike quickly moved through about African influencers, I counted at least 6. Now, 6 out of those 10 people were Kenyans. All right? Now, as he mentioned, a good number of them are male, but one of them was female, and she was like, yeah, it's like we're catching up on guys soon. But I think this stat tells us that business can't function the same way any longer, at least not in Kenya. And so Kenya has become a hotbed for people with pilots, with ideas, and certainly looking to say, look, whether it's for the marketplace, whether it's for partners or in the supply chain, we actually can pursue some of these trends and use that to arrive at a new way to define social business. And one example from Dion and his colleague Peter Kim that I like is one of the ways that they've described social business is that it draws on trends in technology, right, work and society to improve business outcomes. Some of the outcomes which Dan was able to mention earlier. And the better we look at the rest of the content, the more we'll see there's actual businesses meeting, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes deliberately, some of these business outcomes thanks to this. Now, Jamie Foxx aside, if you're a business and you're looking at a telecommunication company who's created a hotbed for content and for people to interact with what they've got, you find a company shifting from being very, like I mentioned, very slow to innovate, very slow to move, towards creating micro projects, almost pilot projects that people can be part of, and that fail or succeed pretty fast, but a lot of times you see transformations start to take place. One of those such examples back in Kenya is, if any of you has been to Nairobi, the time you're going to spend in traffic is sad. It really is. It's an abomination, the amount of time that we have to spend on the road. Now, for a company that's made it incredibly cheap to access data for as little as 8 South African cents or less, for whether it's 10 megabytes and so on, or less than R1. You can get 10 megabytes for less than R1 there. And on a feature phone, that's going to take you a long time. So why would having broken it down to all these levels of micro-billing, why would the same company go ahead to say in all of these taxis that we know are sprawled all across the roads, making it very difficult to get anywhere in the first place because they drive terribly, why don't we fit them with free Wi-Fi? Right? So you have now free wireless connectivity within taxis. So people who are in that commute, the people around them, that sign on the your top right, I believe, says, caution, if you're able to read the sign, then you're within the free Wi-Fi range, right? And so it's, for motorists and for pedestrians and whoever's in between, this makes sense because you think, oh, fantastic, I've got Wi-Fi. But what they were doing is essentially one bit of a larger domino effect that attracts content creators to them, right? Now, they don't have a very trusted position amongst content creators, but beyond being a dumb pipe, if they create opportunities like this for people in an industry where in Kenya it's possibly not much like here in some respects, we've got a fantastic value chain and some very gifted content creators, but just not a lot of people who are able to see the returns of the content they create, piracy and other reasons coming to make that happen. And so people don't essentially even sell records, and not by the traditional way of I made a CD and I sold 1 million copies. It's I make a single, I use that single to close a deal with the likes of Safaricom, who will, as part of this, maybe by signing up, you get a copy of the song. And so other examples like that speak to creating this and allowing innovators and technologists to create apps on top of this, and certainly given our public transit system and innovating there. Now, Safaricom stands out for also the leadership change. So internally as a business, Safaricom got started in social media almost by mistake. And part of the reason that is there was a top executive of Safaricom at a conference in, I believe it was around 2009, 2010. And they got there, there's a lot of developers in the room, and this had been the first time that someone from senior management had presented themselves in front of a community for them to solicit some feedback and obviously to exchange some thoughts. Now, they got lambasted, to put it very politely, because it was the first time anybody had a place to direct any feedback towards. And this prompted a lot of question asking, because certainly they were doing great as an enterprise with their consumers, but they still saw that there was a lot of feedback that wasn't coming their way. And this was not only from developers, but from their community at large. And at that time, Michael Joseph was the CEO, likened to Mr. Jobs and a lot of other people, not only for his innovation and certainly what he's been able to build with the company and taking it public and so on, but even his leadership style. And the transition between Michael Joseph and Bob Collymore signified a very, very big changeover in social media's position within that enterprise. In terms of the collaboration that takes place now, in terms of what, besides, not SharePoint, but the intranet, the office intranet, which is certainly no more, and much more sophisticated measures are in place now at Safaricom. But beyond that, it was a much more open style of leadership, and that trickled its way down and allowed social media to flourish within the organization and certainly outside of it. And one good example here was when there's a few examples up there that I can talk through, when after outsourcing it for well over a year and trying to figure out where the challenges were, they saw that to transform, much like Dion said, for Ford, it takes a day. So one working day to make some of these responses. For Safaricom, it was 48 hours when they got started. And this was the tweets. So they would acknowledge a tweet and then say, we will get back to you in 48 hours. And in a matter of months, people drove it in over and over, and especially to some of the top leadership, this would not suffice. But it didn't mean just transforming the way that they respond and actually relate directly with their consumers. It meant changing the way the call center was structured. It meant changing the way they interacted with the segment of consumers, because the people who bothered to tweet them in the first place were, one, data users. And with falling average revenue per user, it was a great way of actually segmenting one of their most important groups of clients. And so why not offer them preferential service, which is what they did. They went to the extent of creating an internal team between, now it ranges somewhere between in the 20s. But at that time, it expanded and contracted, and it had people in customer service and sales, and some of them very, very detailed in terms of certain segments of their customers who they would service. And they actually started to promote who these individuals were. And each one of them, some of them who you could see there, had at least 4 years working the call center, 4 years working different parts of the organization. And they would take on the face of what Safaricom was going to be, thanks to the new transition from the top down. Now, that example, and with M-Pesa and the likes, has brought a great kind of layer for ideas to take place. So you've got payments and you've got social taking place. And with that, on the top right there, you see a ticker. I don't know if it's very clear there, but that ticker has the number 67 million. And so one of the things that happened was knowing people's compulsion to share, and certainly with this idea of crowdfunding as it is now, part of what led to M-Pesa's success was the ingrained culture, what we call Harambee in Kenya, which is this idea of mobilizing resources, specifically money in a lot of cases, around causes for family, for friends, for total strangers, and Kenyans feeling an actual, as part of like our national fabric, a compulsion to give, no matter how little. And in the case that we had in 2011, when famine was declared in the northeastern part of the country, what started out as a hashtag on Twitter with someone saying, look, we can't have these images actually flood through our timelines as Kenyans and not be able to do something. And so they started what was initially just trying to have people send mobile money. So I'm not going to ask you to appear anywhere physically, but if you can send mobile money here, we're going to track it through this hashtag and we'll make sure we get meals out there some way, somehow. That snowballed into a national campaign, which was spearheaded by Safaricom and a lot of some larger partners in the industry, and raised well in excess of $5 million. Right? And this is micropayment. So people who previously would have bought some airtime were able to take that and send it through. And it was tracked on social media and became a global case study, at least for Kenya, on crowdfunding, on mobile money, and where social ties those two things together. A good example of how Safaricom relates with some of their customers now is it's not entirely visible there, but there's an exchange with a young, ambitious student here who has found love in a place he might not have expected to find it, and has actually gone to Safaricom to ask for their help. Now, the position of telecommunications companies has shifted. Banks never had a lot of trust associated with them and so on, but airtime and the fact that about 99% of Kenya being a largely prepaid market, airtime is something which, you scratch it, you put it in your phone. There's a sense just going through that over and over, that creates trust in the brand itself. And so here's what I thought was a really interesting, very recent example of Safaricom turning what is otherwise a call from somebody very randomly asking for assistance. He says, I have a lady who he's just finished high school, and he says there's an older lady who he would like to court, right? And he puts this onto the Safaricom page, and immediately customers, right? So Safaricom customers, existing ones, come in and tell him, wrong place for this, what are you doing? What do you think this is? And Safaricom get back to him and say this, dear sir, thank you for for getting in touch with us. Now they ask him to dial *544#, and they've created a bundle just for this. They say, look, we know, because they're actually able to look at his airtime and so on. They see how much he has. They see how much he spends, right? So behind the wall, taking some of this data that they have and feeding it back into social, and they actually picked the exact bundle he would need to type and gave him the 4 instructions he'd need to put in to talk to his new lady. And people applauded this. It was doing the rounds on social, just saying that that's the kind of way that a brand should do it. Most people would scratch their heads and wonder, well, where do we start with this? We don't want to touch it. There's been a whole number of reasons why, at least in the Kenyan news media, this looks like bait for, to kind of trap the brand into saying something. So a lot of people applauded this as an idea. Now, here, standing in front of you, when we talk about social, specifically social business, we think in terms of technology, we're talking about smartphones, and it's a foregone conclusion sometimes that we'd be talking about social networks, or at least the principles of social networking. But that man in the bottom right corner there changed a lot of that thinking, not only for Kenya, but certainly as far out as the story was able to get told. That man there is named Chief Karaoke, and he is a chief in a very, very obscure part of the country who happened to hear about one of the ways, again, Safaricom to not only compete, was able to strike a deal with Twitter that said, look, for any one number of you people here in the room, I can tell you a command that you can all put into your phones, and essentially you could follow me on Twitter without Twitter ever acknowledging it on the website, but every tweet that I would send would appear as an SMS to each and every one of you. So what a great way to stay in touch with people, right? To build on this idea of Twitter and what social media is without you bearing the cost of it directly. Now, for me, I would have to essentially send an SMS for that to become a tweet, or log in somewhere to send a tweet, but all of you would receive that. And Chief Kariuki, upon discovering this, went out to what was a few dozen people. He has to meet with people every 2 weeks as part of what's called a baraza. It's an actual government directive. You meet with people in this very small sub-location every few weeks, and he told this command. And 2 weeks later, he asked everybody he told to tell somebody else. And as we're talking now, there's well over 50,000 people that he reaches with a tweet. And most of those aren't even on the website at all. He has foiled robberies, like when a goat goes missing, somebody calls him, and I'm not lying. And minutes later, we're talking about a huge geography now, right? He's able to just send an SMS, say, the goat's this color, it's about this big, it's got a rope on its neck, and it was left wandering. And people would would actually bring it back either to him or somewhere else. And brands, and certainly a lot of people were so taken aback. You think that social implies this sophisticated technology, but in some cases, even the households where people were receiving these messages, some of the people there weren't even literate. And so they would have somebody, they'd see a message and they'd know it's from the chief, and you would take it to somebody in the house who would share it. And so what I think the chief, in this case, was able to show is that social media, especially if you're looking at the rest of Africa, isn't about technology, and it's not technology and then what. It goes back a level further to asking, if you've got a mobile phone, that's a great place to start. In fact, as was mentioned this morning, some companies talk about being mobile first. Africa is essentially mobile only. And then you add water, add whatever you'd like to add after that. Going back up to Egypt. Now, Egypt, certainly my heart goes out to everybody there with what's going on now. It's a very trying time for them. But beyond just the Arab Spring, right, faith in government, in institutions waned. And this created an interesting opportunity, not only just for brands, but for startups and people to take what is otherwise this critical mass people are able to bring out and have people meet and interact in that same way, but with a business objective, or like we said earlier, business outcomes in mind. And Bayolak does that in what I consider a pretty interesting way. Now, the idea is not novel. What they essentially do is they arm Cairo passengers and people in transit, which if you thought Nairobi traffic is anything to behold, you have no idea what you're in for with Cairo. 20 million people in a city and absolute pandemonium. People plan things a day at a time, or a day in advance at best, and people are very lenient even with time, to the point of, my friend has meetings at 2 in the morning. He's been based out of there because that's the time that somebody's actually going to come out and see you. And it's not a joke. And they expect you to shower and so on and actually get ready to meet. So if you can take whatever element that people have with them at the time, this being mobile phones in particular, right? So not assuming that they have access to social media, but going a step back and saying what can we use from people who have these phones and turn into social data, into social insights that we can extract and use to add value. That's what Bayolak pursued. And so they allowed everyday citizens, being stuck in traffic, to give advice. So a very simple rating system, which became a little more sophisticated. And it allowed people to contribute from very different parts of the entire city of Cairo and Alexandria to start about traffic. Very straightforward. Now, what it evolved into was a place which brands started to get attached to, because this same army of very well-informed, very well-connected influencers were not only able to speak to traffic and so on, but in terms of the conversation you could engage them with, it brought a new level of insight for brands looking, again, to tap into what they were seeing socially. And it ended up evolving towards even informing people about protests, demonstrations, the police, and so on and so forth. Now, Nigeria, I was surprised actually in the list that this company didn't come up. Now, Guaranty Trust Bank is, banking is, like I said, banking, telecoms, these don't tend to be industries where you see a revolution take place. Big ships take long to turn, and certainly it's taken more than 1,000 years for the banking industry to take shape, 30 years for the credit card industry to achieve critical mass. But with what we've seen with mobile and social, and for example, Kenya, across Africa and Nigeria, there's one particular brand which I think as far back as 2009, when I started writing about what they were doing, they actually were very intentional about social media. They got it from as far back as, was launching in 2009 and being very deliberate about making sure that their customer engagement was social and designed for social. Now, at the moment, they've got, they're 1 million likes strong, the highest for any bank in Africa, I believe, but I stand corrected. And they've even gone to the point of recently launching a social media bank account. So you can essentially now, as a Facebook user anywhere in Nigeria, sign up on Facebook, begin to transact. And I guess once you make a couple more formal arrangements, get an actual bank card, and keep and maintain this on Facebook, geared and designed for mobile, and certainly from then on with PCs and the web, but giving an example of what social banking would do, and they have now used this to draw people towards, for example, their mobile money offering, which in Nigeria, much more at stake than, let's say, Kenya, only because of the scale you could potentially unlock if you gave the right product. And what I think these stories start to hint at is that a lot of the assumptions about doing and pursuing social in the rest of the continent aren't as obvious at first. It's SMS, it's literacy, it's thinking about engaging people through what is otherwise something that's been there a long time and has been kept by the gatekeepers, as it were, who are the telecommunications companies. And I'm not that surprised to see them doing well in these different regions, only because the stakes are so much higher. There's so much more to lose, and they don't even have as much time, because as their clients and customers and partners certainly get more and better access, they see the opportunity to become the one place people go for content. And you can actually reinvent the entire business model of what it means to be a telecommunications provider in markets like this. Now, to be absolutely clear, one thing, I love everything that I heard about Kenya, but at the same time, well over 70% of the population has never had an internet experience. Some would say it's even 80. And that is in a market which, as you heard, has arguably 80% of, not 80%, I'm sorry, but has a large number of influencers and a very, very connected community known as KOT, or Kenyans on Twitter. But we do blow the numbers out of proportion in terms of what they're able to unlock, and in also underestimating how large the slice of the pie is. People like Chief Karaoke hold a lot more because they're actually pursuing offline engagement and turning this idea of what social and what social business was on its head. And he's actually pursuing some for-profit ideas that are certainly worth mentioning, using, again, SMS, and what in this case was just Twitter and an agreement with the telco in this case. But for Kenya, there's so much that's held in our future that I think at the moment we've only seen really the tip of the iceberg. Now I'll end with this. This is a pretty interesting project. It's a typeface that tried to take this idea of the continent, which is a lot of the time the way we see things. We see your country and the rest of the continent. And the ambition of this was not only just because typefaces are cool, but also because a lot of times we lump everything together. It's sub-Saharan Africa, or it's Northern Africa, or it's Southern Africa, or it's Eastern Africa. But I think what you'll find not only with, and I'd love to see it also in the report and actually see that the data confirms it, is that you have to almost take it by geography. And by geography, we're talking about regions. And so Kenya is the hub for at least 5 other countries. And so what you find working well in social in Kenya is picking well in places like Uganda, where there's a couple brands there who've, through rewarding people through airtime and mobile money, have seen you can tie social and SMS, and they've created, in this particular case, there's one insurance company there who've taken their existing Facebook following, meager, right? So probably 1,500 people, perhaps 2,000 at the moment. And they've had their own consumers sell and resell insurance to each other. for a commission. Essentially cutting out a part of what is their bread and butter, their gravy offline, but taking it online and seeing, we're going to do this and we're going to wait and see what happens. And up to this point, I think it's about 18% of those people with, who've liked the page who continue to sell to people who continue to like the page, and they're actually onto something. Now, whether it transforms their business is neither here nor there. At least at this point, it's not entirely clear how far it's going to go. But with the small audience that they've experimented with, and some of the things they've picked up from larger companies pursuing the same in places like Kenya, it's shown that the better you take it, I guess a region at a time, perhaps with West Africa, it's Nigeria, though any Ghanaians here might have, disagree. I think what we'll find is the equation at the end of the day starts with, one, looking outside of South Africa, but secondly, assuming that you don't add everything and get mobile, but that you start with mobile and everything else seems to make more sense for whatever part of the continent you're looking at. Thank you.